I've worked in the UK utility sector not quite as long as David, since 1991. And what David said about the industry having been through change before is very true. We've had a number of significant changes to how the market prices electricity over time. And in general, we've got through those fairly okay. In fact, one of the main instruments that we'll talk about in this presentation, which is contract for differences, which has received a lot of criticism from many sectors, was the stable instrument that was used to manage electricity price risk throughout most of the 1990s. What is slightly different about the change program that we have this time is that it's much more driven by government rather than driven by the industry, which was characteristic of previous changes. So what I wanted to talk about this morning was really around one specific issue of the proposals around electricity market reform. So yesterday the government introduced a very significant pack of information, 200 or 300 pages, detailing their latest proposals supporting the draft energy bill, and a lot of details behind market reform, how the various instruments were going to get implemented, what the cost-benefit analysis of some of those proposals were. But right at the front, they made one statement, which is that EMR will secure the investment needed to deliver a diverse low-carbon technology mix, which I thought was a fairly bold statement. So what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just unpick that and try and challenge it and see whether do we really believe that's the case. The numbers that are required are staggering. So David talked about 200 billion. The number for purely power generation investment is somewhere up to 110 billion. So the instruments that are being proposed in terms of a contract for difference, that's designed to deliver 110 billion of investment by 2020. Okay, so we'll just talk a little bit about, as an introduction, one component of EMR. So David gave an overview. What I wanted to talk about was the contract for difference specifically as an instrument. So as I said, we have had these before in the market. It's designed to take away price risk from low carbon generators. So what it means is that you get a contract, and under that contract, the price of electricity that you receive is fixed for a period somewhere between 10, 15 or 20 years, depending on which type of technology you're investing in. And why is that attractive? Well, the principle behind this is that, and we'll come on to this shortly, is that we need a lot of new money to flow into our energy markets to fund this type of investment. And a lot of those investors don't like too much risk around what the potential cash a project could produce. So if you can fix the revenue of a project, that's deemed to be a more attractive investment for third-party investors. So there's a lot of detail within the papers that now describes how in practice these instruments will get allocated on a different technology by technology basis. So a few messages that I took from reading some of the volume of paper that was produced yesterday. One is that the government have been consistent. So they started this process back in December 2010 when they first launched their proposed changes to the market. There's been a number of updates since then. But what they've set out is a journey to move from a market in 2010 to a market in 2014 that's going to facilitate, they hope, this level of investment. And one of the constant criticisms that government get is that they keep chopping and changing all the time. So although people might not agree with all the proposed changes, at least they've shown a level of consistency in terms of the path and direction of travel that they're going down. And one of the reasons why I think that there's been a lot of criticism from the industry associated with some of the proposed changes is that historically, when the market has gone through change, there's been a much greater alignment between industry players in terms of what they want out of the change process. What we're seeing this time round is that some of the big energy players, they have different positions, different interests and different technologies, and that's driving a slightly different response to the proposals. As I said, the mechanics around how the contract for difference is supposed to work is now becoming quite a bit more clearer. One of the other instruments that David referred to is a capacity mechanism. So what the government have done, and I think it's quite an important recognition, is that originally they said, well, we'll bring in a capacity mechanism by 2020. So the principle behind the capacity mechanism was that if, in the event that it looked like there wasn't enough generation on the system, the government could pay an additional payment to either new or existing generators to make that capacity available. And what they've now recognised is that there are some scenarios that you could draw out whereby the potential constraint around security of supply that we thought we might have by 2020 could now happen a lot earlier. So they've accelerated the delivery of that mechanism, and that should give them some flexibility in the event that some of these scenarios play out. There is a final point, which is it's a bit detailed, but it's also quite important, which is that the way that the legal framework for these contracts and how payments flow, because again, the customers will pay for this one way or another. So there's a process that's been described whereby the generator who builds this power station, he gets paid a payment that's basically collected by suppliers. So suppliers will put a premium onto everyone's energy bill, collect that money, and then pass the money over to the generators. And there are some potential outstanding concerns around what's been proposed in that. Right, so a couple of points on this chart. So the relevance of this is that the reason why government have said that we need to change to a contract for difference is because if you look at most of the low carbon technologies that are being proposed to be built, so i.e. nuclear, offshore wind, onshore wind, they're characterised by having very high upfront costs of capital and then generally pretty low costs over the life of the asset. So the cost of capital that someone that's building one of those projects uses is a very significant determinant of the cost of energy that they require to invest in the project. So what we tried to do here is if you took the cost of capital for a typical offshore wind developer, so the numbers are nearly 11%, what you can do is you can disaggregate that into its component parts. And the one bit that's designed to be dealt with by EMR is quite a small percentage of the overall cost of capital. So yes, it is true that that by going through this huge change process, you have the potential to reduce costs for investors. They're not that significant in the overall scheme of things. And actually there are some other areas, particularly around risk and how risks are managed in building these big projects, that are much more important. So if you look at what's happened with new nuclear projects that have been built around Europe in the last 4 or 5 years, most of them are very, very significantly delayed and very significantly over budget. So building projects more efficiently is probably more important than the mechanism that's used to reward them. So I'm not going to really spend too long on this because it's fairly detailed, but there is an important message in this, which is that and we're seeing this the way the consultation process is working out, is that there's always a risk that when you make changes to a market, and remember that what's happening in terms of electricity market reform is just one of a series of changes that are happening right across the board. So there's always a risk that when you pull a lever in one place, it has an unintended consequence somewhere else. And it's a very important part of the process over the next 3 or 6 months that all of these issues are worked out properly. And one thing that we're trying to highlight here is that there's a potential problem. So at the moment, everybody's worried about how do you keep the generator or the guy who's building the asset happy, but there's a potential problem for the guy who's got to collect all the money from the customers to pass it over to him, which is he's got to figure out in any period how much money does he need to collect. And if he doesn't collect the right amount of money, or he over collects or under collects, that potentially exposes suppliers to quite a lot of risk. Okay, I'm not going to spend any more time on that. So just a few words on the funding requirements. So what we've tried to show here is that if you look at if you look at one of the scenarios that we've got for the deployment of, this is just looking at offshore wind in the UK out to 2020, how much money is required to build out that level of offshore wind, and it's roughly about £60 billion. And then if you look at the bar chart underneath, what that shows is if you stack up all the available sources of capital that we think can realistically be targeted, you get a gap in between these two numbers. So, and part of the challenge of EMR is, well, is it going to deliver and fund this gap? So that will be the test of whether it's successful or not. But what else is happening in the market? So we know that people are looking at banks as a source of capital to try and help to fund and cover the costs of projects. The banking sector, as everybody is aware of, is going through unprecedented change at the moment. Significantly increased regulation. They're all trying to reduce the amount of debt that they hold on their balance sheet, so they're actually lending less. The cost to them of providing money on a long-term basis is becoming more and more expensive. So there's a significant structural change happening in the banking sector, which is coinciding with the energy sector requiring significant amounts of capital. So it looks like one of the historical routes for funding is kind of cut off. But the other area where I think a lot more attention needs to be placed is institutional capital. So that's the money that we put into our pension funds and insurance funds that currently gets invested in government bonds. One of the absolute fundamental requirements is that over the next 10 years we start to find a way to get those companies to invest their money in UK energy infrastructure. This is not UK infrastructure full stop. So it's not just about energy, it's about rail, ports and other types of infrastructure. And at the end of the day then, energy needs to be able to compete and stack up against other types of technologies. So let's do that. So the final slide. So don't believe all the negative publicity about contracts for differences. I think that as an instrument they can work. There's a lot of detail that's really important that needs to be worked out in the next 3 to 6 months. But will they on their own deliver the level of investment that's required? I think the answer to that is no, they won't. So we need to hit a number of other things in parallel. So one is around stability across all the energy policy initiatives that are happening at the moment, so people have much more clarity and certainty around all the changes that are happening. There's a significant role for industry. So the costs of renewable technologies, the cost of offshore wind is currently too high. The industry, government recognise that, and there's an important role for industry in getting these costs down over the next 5 to 10 years. Getting better at building big capital projects, managing the risks through those processes is going to be very, very important to deliver lower cost projects. A lot more in terms of this point around engagement between government, industry, and these sources of capital that currently don't invest in energy infrastructure assets. A point that actually is not really discussed at all in any of the debates is whether the level of return that's available to investors in UK energy assets is sufficient to make them invest. And at the end of the day, investors look at two things. They look at the level of risk and they look at the level of return. So the industry can do their bit in terms of managing risk, but fundamentally one of the big questions that needs to be worked out in the next couple of years is when they price these contracts to generators, is what level of return is appropriate to attract all this new money. And of course that has a cost. And the final point is, more stability in financial markets, but that's something that any of us don't have much control over, and it doesn't look like there's going to be much of that in the next couple of years. So that's it. Thank you.